borrowers and the savers are making a decision about debt or equity. From a central banker's perspective, is there any long-term way of looking at a more stable system where you encourage the stock markets vis-a-vis the debt? And within the debt, corporate bonds versus bank debts?
Yeah. So it's a very good question. This is all about the banking system intermediating. So it raises the larger question, why don't we have a system where we have corporate bonds and we have equity? Well, the point, however, is in a situation where entrepreneurs need monitoring, need hand-holding up front, that some kind of an institutional form of finance rather than arm's-length form of finance, an institution that can build a relationship, can monitor actively, may be necessary. So for small and medium enterprises, for even larger enterprises in an emerging economy, banks may be essential. Even in mature economies, banks may not be as important, though they are still somewhat important, may not be as important in lending because there are alternative sources of finance, but banks are often important in using their balance sheets to manage risks, to offer guarantees, for example, guarantees of liquidity, standby letters of credit, lines of credit. These are all things that banks do even in mature economies. So think of this as that range of activities. And clearly there are some activities where the firm is trusted, the firm has a reputation, the firm is old and mature, has a well understood business, it can borrow from the bond markets and it can issue a lot of equity. But where it is younger, doesn't have a huge amount of collateral, is starting off, or the business is untested, bank debt is more likely, and that's the kind of model, that's what we're looking at.
Well, I get the question relates. It has two parts, but it's one question. You deal with a liquidity crisis by addressing a solvency issue, which involves improving the solvency of the bank, but not necessarily immediately providing the liquidity it needs to meet the run, because it takes time. So my concern is the time inconsistency. Now, what if, to make it more like quantitative easing, instead the central bank buys the projects from the banks that are facing a run? Or perhaps, as was discussed in the autumn of 2008, offers to buy assets across the system, but that's extremely expensive, versus what turned out to be TARP, where the selectivity was dealt with by forcing banks, including those that didn't necessarily need the injection of liquidity, to accept the injection of liquidity, so as not to distinguish those that really were in trouble. That's all ends with a question mark.
Right.
But it has to do with time inconsistency.
No. So let me address the time inconsistency. The point in this model is it's very hard to tell the solvency crisis from an aggregate liquidity crisis. So if in fact lending in general starts getting very constrained in the system, because fear, this, that, in this model it's because there are too few depositors willing to put their money. That's the shock. You can call it fear, you can call it something. Here it is anticipating strong consumption growth. But the shock is such that too little liquidity is pumped into the system, so interest rates start taking off. As interest rates start taking off, what was a liquidity problem turns into a solvency problem. So the way to reverse that is to bring the interest rates down so that those assets discounted at the new market interest rate are in fact enough to pay off the liability. That's what is being done. However, your point is a good one, which is what about the central bank taking off some of these loans of the banker's balance sheet and replacing it with higher value? Sort of, if you discount it at the market interest rate, you won't make a difference because that's what the market is doing. But if you discount it at a lower interest rate and essentially you give them more than the assets they're pledging with you. You don't buy the assets at the fire sale price. That could help. But that would be like a bailout. And remember, in the original model, you still need the banker to collect those assets for you. So the banker will now, because he doesn't have demand deposits, extract the rents. So in the self-contained model, that doesn't help. It's the same as a bailout. Great.
Sorry.
But your point about the distinction between solvency and liquidity is very important. We always tend to think they're two different animals. But they could be the same animal. It just depends on what the prevailing interest rate is, what the availability of liquidity is. And that's precisely why they say these bailouts didn't hurt, because they converted the liquidity problem, they addressed the liquidity problem, and therefore these things weren't insolvent anymore.
My question is about, like, in general, these models, because stylish models are really good to give intuition, to give insights, but they're also super sensitive to the assumptions you do. And this seems kind of risky when you're doing policy making. So my question is, which is the appropriate way to use this theory into the normal practice of policy making?
Very good question. And what I would say is, you should never become a prisoner of your model, but use it as a crutch to think about policy. Okay? So, with this kind of model, what are the things that perhaps one can understand better? What are the benefits of central bank intervention? It's not case by case. It doesn't bail out specific banks or bankers. That's probably a good thing. It's a system-wide intervention. And as a result, you don't get drawn into specific negotiations. What are the costs? The costs are, because there is no political sort of opprobrium associated with cutting interest rates particularly low, because there is no backlash until most recently in some countries, it's too tempting to do it. And because it's tempting to do it, you create the possibility that bankers anticipate such reductions. After all, it's happened a number of times in recent years that central banks have accommodated to crises by cutting interest rates deeply. And therefore, that creates the very leverage that you were trying to avoid, or the very illiquid positions in the banks that you were trying to avoid. I think all that is broadly plausible. Now, the details, do these kinds of crises occur when there's excessive optimism or when current conditions are really bad? I mean, both are plausible in the model. Which one is it? I mean, it could be either. Often crises happen when things are really going through the roof, right? 1929, everybody was really very optimistic, and suddenly, wham, crisis hit. So that could be accommodated in the model. Precise interventions, the precise bargaining, do bankers really bargain? No, obviously they don't. But it's really about rents in the system. When is it that banker bonuses go up in the system? When is it that the cost of capital falls tremendously in the system? One of the things pre-financial crisis was, because of the extreme degree of leverage, the cost of financing was also very, very low, right? That the realized cost of financing for a number of entities. That would be something that can be picked up in the model. Typically, when making policy, you look at a variety of models to try and understand what's going on, because they cover a variety of, yes, models are very specific to a particular situation and assume away more complexity. Bring in other models to think about about other aspects. Having a model which addresses every facet of the real world and describes everything in detail is pretty much useless, because it would be so complicated. It would be very difficult to understand what moved what. So therefore, you need to essentially streamline models, and that's what one does.
With regards to the quantitative easing, you talked about to affect incentives in line with your policy To what extent does the composition of the quantitative easing, as in what securities are actually bought, government securities, corporate bonds, comparing the US and the Bank of England to the ECB, to what extent does the composition of the quantitative easing make a difference?
The way quantitative easing is intended to work is what is sometimes called the portfolio balance approach, right? You're taking off some assets from the portfolio of investors. As they readjust, it changes prices. Now, there is an argument sometimes people make that people, if they can adjust fully for the stuff that's taken off there, if I can go out and buy bonds at the same price that the central bank has taken bonds away from my balance sheet, I may not have changed anything. But it is by altering that composition, by buying enough of that stuff, by forcing some entities to really alter their portfolios, that I change the pricing of alternative assets also. So if I don't restrict myself to buying government bonds or buy other assets, presumably I have a larger effect on the portfolio of investors, and that again changes the pricing. Now precisely which way it does is something that depends on the assumptions made about investor preferences and so on. But when I mentioned offhand quantitative easing, essentially I was saying that what the central bank in my model is doing is something like quantitative easing. By essentially feeding a certain kind of asset into investor portfolios, it is changing their preferences and essentially making them do something different. And that's how the interest rate effects come up. So it has sort of same principles, but works in somewhat different ways.
Can I come back to the question of the bond markets and the leakage from these mop-up operations? Clearly, the present time banks have been banks have been very much brought under control. There's much more capital controls being brought in, whilst you maintain obviously interest rates so low. But the effects of that seem to me to actually have enlarged the bond market quite substantially, and that's not only in developed markets. If one looks at China at the present time, for example, the bond market there has grown extremely rapidly. And I wonder whether you feel comfortable as a central banker that at the end of this, you just transfer the problem to another area. You'll end up being the market maker of last resort and not the lender of last resort.
No, this is a point I have made elsewhere, echoing similar thoughts, that if you put too much constraints on one part of the financial system, regulated too much, activity shifts elsewhere. And sometimes that elsewhere is better able to absorb the risks, sometimes it's not. And are we sure that the place where activity has shifted is able to absorb the risk? That's one. And two, from a liquidity perspective, we focus our liquidity intervention on the banks. We lend to them in terms of trouble. What if the activity that requires liquidity has shifted elsewhere? Are we so sure that the banks will re-lend into those areas when in times of trouble? Or not only do we have the banks backing away from market making, but we have them backing away from liquidity provision to those areas, in which case the central bank will be forced to intervene directly in providing liquidity to those entities that now are taking those kinds of illiquid risks. So that is a clear concern. I think the FSB, BIS are looking at these issues of how activity migrates to the shadow banking system. Is there enough market making in the shadow banking system? Is there enough access to liquidity? And hopefully, we take actions that ensure we don't push the problem from one side to another.
Thank you. My question is, how easy is it to formulate economic policies in a country like India, or I would say in any developing country like India?
how easy is it to formulate economic policy?
Yes, it's
Actually, it's very easy. I think it's harder to implement the policy, but formulation is very easy. I mean, more seriously, I think the joy of trying to formulate policy in a developing country or an emerging market is there are many more places where I think good policy can have significant effects. And in that sense, there are lots of low-hanging fruit, mixing many metaphors, but there are lots of low-hanging fruit, and often there's no real impediment to plucking them. So if you implement, if you focus on taking those, now you have to be a little intelligent about what fruit are easy to pick and what are not so easy. And if they're not so easy, develop strategies to make, if they're important, develop strategies to do that. So a lot of policy formulation is economics 101. Just like in industrial countries, there's a lot of stuff which doesn't require deep insights in economics. To my mind, the deeper insights come when you're trying to make it politically feasible to undertake those policies. You have to offer alternatives, you have to offer cushions. So you can't bulldoze your way in some of these situations, and therefore you have to be a little more clever, so to speak. You have to understand where altering your policy from economics 101 will make very little difference but be politically more acceptable, and where it actually makes a difference to the economic outcome.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to know, in what ways do the policy implications change of this model depending on the ownership structure of the banks, like public and private banks?
Not really in this model. I mean, so long as the banker wants to maximize, is not a saint, but wants to maximize private benefits, it wouldn't matter what the ownership is. Because the banker is basically trying to extract rents for his or her specific skills. So the precise ownership would not matter in this model.
Do you think there are likely to be conflicts between central banks' objectives in terms of financial stability and their macroeconomic objectives?
Well, so it's a very good question, because this entire model where I switched from central planner to central bank at some point in the model is couched without taking into account any inflation mandate for the central bank. And so you can obviously see a situation where in fact they may conflict, and the classic, not so much in a liquidity crunch where inflation is likely to also come down because of the excess amount of liquidation, etc., that's happening. Economic activity is down, inflation will probably be down, and therefore cutting interest rates, flooding the market with liquidity is not necessarily at odds with the central bank's inflation mandate. The real concern comes on the other side when we say raise interest rates a little faster. Well, if inflation is still very quiescent, it's at odds with the central bank's inflation mandate, but it may help in setting a better course for financial stability. So that's the place where they're at odds.
In a low interest rate environment, how do you, I think this is something which has possibly not been getting that much attention, which is
the problem with pension funds, they've been investing a lot in what's called, I think, yield-seeking assets. As a policymaker, could you possibly suggest a solution to a problem where they essentially have to meet future demands, keep assets invested in a relatively higher yielding assets, yet they cannot find that in a safer area? So how could anyone possibly tackle that problem?
It is a problem. I don't think there's an easy solution to this. Think of these guys as being the guys who are the guys who are chucked out of the model, who want high interest rates but can't get it. That's really the guys who are paying the price. So I think the point is that this low interest rate environment is not without cost. It benefits the levered entities, and if those are the guys we're relying on to get economic activity back on track, that's probably a good thing from the perspective of economic activity. But it's not costless. Somebody is paying for these low interest rates by getting lower interest rates than they would otherwise get. And that's your pension fund. In fact, some people argue that could cause even perversity. That rather than increasing activity, those kinds of concerns could reduce activity as I save more, given the low returns on my pension fund. Now, I don't want to go into that because that's further from my model, but it is a real cost. Somebody has to pay the price. These are not costless interventions. Is there a question there?
Thank you. So currently, like some of the state-owned banks in India are facing some serious bad corporate debts, right? So are there any lessons that can be applied from this model to sort of rectify that issue?
I want to stay away from that. I want to stay away from that. I don't think this model is really about them. So very far from that. Some question up here?
Hi, thank you. I was wondering, since we're moving from planner to central banks, how would the independence of central banks play a role in this particular model?
So, this goes to what you mean by independence, right? And I think this is a very important question. A truly independent central bank would have a heart of stone and not worry about what happens to the system. They would not intervene ex post, right? And bail out the system through low interest rates or through direct intervention. Of course, there will be enormous pain in the system, but this is the hard-hearted central bank saying, I don't care if the system collapses. Now, you could say that a central bank with an inflation mandate would still intervene, because it says if the system collapses, I get into serious deflation, so I have to intervene to help the system have a moderate rate of inflation. But its help would not be as much as in a situation where it basically said, I have to care about jobs, I have to care about people who are rendered unemployed by these banks failing. Therefore, that central bank with a heart would intervene much more. Okay. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Just to follow up,
yeah.
It's just a given or like presumed in theory that the more independent a central bank is, the more they'll target low inflation rates. So that will again go against the recommendation of low interest rate in this particular scenario.
No, typically, let's say an independent central bank has an inflation band it has to stay within, right? So if the central bank is independent and just has to maintain that inflation mandate, it sees a looming financial crisis. Does it intervene? And the answer is possibly yes, because if it didn't intervene, you could have massive destruction of value in the economy, massive liquidations, tons of banks falling under, a great depression, and deflation. Now that would mean that it was failing in its objective of maintaining inflation between the two bands, the lower bound and the upper bound. So a sensible but independent central bank may still intervene. However, if the central bank was not focused just on inflation, but also had a growth objective or worried about the popular backlash if there was a serious recession, it might say, even if inflation is not going to fall below the lower bound, I might still intervene in order to provide, in order to perhaps assuage critics who might say, I stood by and watched the system melt down. So you may have more intervention when I care about the politics of the situation. Now, what we've argued is that to some extent, conditional on the event happening, intervention may not be a bad thing. But if I know that intervention is going to happen, it creates moral hazard up front and perverse incentives to take on illiquidity and leverage. Now, we haven't worked out what's the optimal sort of central bank, how much hands-off should it be, but presumably there's a level of hands-off it should be in this model.